The year 1954 is often remembered as the pinnacle of the American dream. It was a time of manicured lawns, the birth of the interstate highway system, and the rapid expansion of the suburbs. Post-war optimism had triggered a housing boom that saw entire towns materialize overnight. In this era of conformity and progress, the sight of a construction crew was as common as a milk delivery. But among the thousands of Cape Cods and ranch-style homes rising across the landscape, a peculiar architectural anomaly began to emerge, one that history has largely overlooked. In the spring of that year, records suggest that approximately 500 identical structures were erected across 17 different states. They were situated on the peripheries of growing residential tracts, often just a few blocks away from the bustling life of new cul-de-sacs. At first glance, they appeared to be standard single-story dwellings, complete with gabled roofs and brick chimneys. But as neighbors began to settle in, they noticed a detail that defied the very purpose of a home. These houses had no windows. There were no shutters, no panes of glass to catch the morning sun, and no curtains to draw at night. The walls were solid, unbroken expanses of clapboard or brick. They had front doors, but those doors lacked knobs or keyholes on the exterior. There were no mailboxes, no paved driveways, and no names on the deeds at the local county clerk's offices. In an age where the fishbowl life of the suburbs was the social norm, these structures stood as silent, blind sentinels. But that wasn't the strangest part. Despite their jarring appearance, there is almost no record of public outcry or even mild curiosity from the surrounding communities. In 1954, America was a nation conditioned by the need to know culture of the Second World War and the rising tensions of the Cold War. If a strange building appeared near a military base or a factory, the unspoken rule was simple: don't ask. To understand why 500 windowless houses could go unquestioned, one must look at the atmosphere of the mid-50s. This was the year of the first hydrogen bomb test at Bikini Atoll. It was the year the Red Scare reached its fever pitch with the McCarthy hearings. People were encouraged to be vigilant, but they were also encouraged to be private. Historians believe that the silent houses, as they were later dubbed in fragmented archival notes, were part of a massive, unacknowledged infrastructure project. Archival photographs from the era show these houses tucked behind rows of budding maple trees, their silhouettes indistinguishable from a regular home if viewed from a distance. Only upon closer inspection did the impossibility of their design become clear. They were houses designed not for people, but for a purpose that required total isolation from the outside world. Early signs of the project appeared in late 1953, when a series of shell companies, often operating under names like General Infrastructure and Supply or Mid-Continent Holdings, began purchasing small, nondescript lots. These lots were frequently located near strategic points, railway junctions, power substations, or the newly laid nodes of the national telephone grid. The construction was remarkably fast. Witnesses, those few who later shared their stories in the 1970s, recalled that the houses were often assembled in less than 48 hours. Trucks would arrive in the middle of the night, and by the second dawn, the windowless structure would be standing. No one was ever seen moving in. No moving vans arrived with furniture. No smoke ever rose from the chimneys. And that's when things began to shift. By the summer of 1954, the sheer number of these units began to create a pattern that was visible only from the air. While each house seemed isolated on a local level, a composite map of their locations reveals a network. They formed a rough, jagged perimeter around the major industrial and political hubs of the United States. Some researchers suggest that these houses were early SAGE nodes, part of the semi-automatic ground environment system designed to detect incoming Soviet bombers. But the SAGE stations were typically massive, concrete blockhouses, not domestic-looking cottages. The windowless houses of 1954 were something different. They were a disguise. A breakthrough in understanding these structures came in the late 1990s, when a retired telecommunications engineer named Arthur Penhaligon, unrelated to the horologists of the previous century, released a collection of personal papers. In them, he described his work for The Project in the autumn of 1954. He wasn't building homes. He was installing what he called dead air cooling systems. Penhaligon's sketches show that beneath the gabled roofs of these windowless houses sat a massive array of vacuum tubes and early transistors. These were not residential spaces. They were primitive, decentralized data hubs. In 1954, computers were the size of rooms and generated immense heat. They required constant cooling and a stable environment, free from the dust and interference of the outside world. But why hide them in plain sight? Why build a computer in a suburban house with no windows? Records suggest that the government feared the vulnerability of centralized command centers. If the Soviet Union launched a nuclear strike, a single hit on a major city would decapitate the nation's ability to coordinate a response. The 500 houses were an experiment in redundancy. They were designed to hold the brains of the nation's infrastructure telegraph relays, early digital switching systems, and perhaps even the first rudimentary precursors to a national emergency broadcast system. But what they found next changed the narrative entirely. In 1955, a local zoning inspector in a suburb outside of Columbus, Ohio, received a complaint about a humming noise coming from one of these unmarked lots. The inspector, a man named Harold Miller, attempted to gain entry. According to his official report, which was suppressed for 30 years, the front door of the house wasn't a door at all. It was a solid steel plate, painted to look like wood. When Miller eventually returned with federal authorities, he was told the site was a high-security utility annex and was ordered to strike the incident from his records. But Miller noted something in his personal diary that didn't align with the utility explanation. He wrote that as he stood near the wall of the house, he didn't just hear a hum, he heard a voice. It wasn't a human voice. It was a rhythmic, repeating sequence of numbers, broadcast at a frequency that made the very air around the house feel heavy. This detail suggests that the houses weren't just storing data they were transmitting, but without windows, antennas, or visible wires, how was the signal being sent? Further investigation into the construction materials of the 1,954 houses reveals that the bricks were not made of clay. They were a specialized composite designed to act as a massive, low-frequency resonator. The entire house was the antenna. This discovery layers the mystery. If 500 houses were acting as a secret, decentralized broadcast network, what were they saying? And who were they talking to? As the 1950s progressed, the mystery of the houses only deepened. While the public remained largely indifferent, a few specialized observers began to notice that the houses were breathing. During the winter months, when snow covered the suburbs, the roofs of the windowless houses remained strangely bare. The heat generated from within was so intense that it melted any snow within minutes of it falling. Yet, even as the silent houses became local curiosities for the neighborhood children, no one ever saw a technician enter or leave. The houses appeared to be entirely autonomous, closed systems operating in the heart of the American family landscape. But the silence was about to be broken. The silence was broken not by a whistleblower or a press leak, but by a catastrophic mechanical failure in a quiet suburb of New Jersey. In October 1958, 4 years after the windowless houses first appeared, Unit 304, a brick-faced cottage situated at the end of a wooded lane, erupted into a localized, intense electrical fire. Local firefighters arrived within minutes, expecting to find a family trapped inside. They were met with a reinforced steel door that defied their standard axes and rams. When they finally utilized a thermal lance to breach the structure, the heat that rolled out was described as industrial, carrying the acrid scent of ozone and burning copper. But as the smoke cleared, the firefighters realized they weren't looking at a home. There was no kitchen, no bedrooms, and no furniture. Instead, the interior of Unit 304 was a single, cavernous room filled with floor-to-ceiling racks of glowing vacuum tubes. Large, spinning magnetic tape reels lined the walls, and the floor was a raised grid of steel tiles, vibrating with the force of massive cooling fans that had finally succumbed to the blaze. But that wasn't the strangest part. When the fire marshal investigated the charred remains, he found a series of thick, lead-shielded cables that didn't lead to the local power grid. Instead, they dived straight into the foundation, disappearing into a concrete shaft that descended 30 feet into the earth. The house was merely a lid, a decorative, suburban camouflage for a subterranean facility that reached far deeper than the neighboring basements. The fire at Unit 304 was quickly scrubbed from the local papers. Federal agents arrived before the embers were cold, seizing the fire marshal's photos and cordoning off the block for national security maintenance. But the incident confirmed what a growing number of shortwave radio enthusiasts had suspected for years. Across the country, hobbyists known as DXers had been tracking a series of strange, localized broadcasts that seemed to originate from the heart of residential neighborhoods. They called these signals the suburbia numbers. Every evening at 6 p.m., a monotonous, synthesized voice would read a string of 5-digit codes, followed by a burst of high-pitched static. By triangulating these signals, the DXs had pinpointed dozens of the 1,954 windowless houses. The realization began to dawn on the technical community. The 500 houses were part of a massive, decentralized cryptographic network. Records suggest that in the early days of the Cold War, the U.S. government was terrified of a single point of failure in its communications. If the Pentagon or the White House were neutralized, these 500 houses would act as a distributed brain, automatically broadcasting pre-programmed instructions to the nation's nuclear silos and naval fleets. This theory aligns with the 70% of established historical facts regarding the development of the continuity of government (COG) protocols. However, the silent houses possessed a feature that even the most advanced military bunkers of the time lacked. As researchers in the 1980s began to map the locations of the surviving houses, they found that they were spaced with mathematical precision, not along military lines, but according to the density of the civilian population. If their only purpose was communication, they could have been built in the desert or on remote mountain peaks. Placing them in the middle of residential tracts served a different, more nuanced purpose. Some historians believe the houses were designed as social buffers. During a nuclear exchange, the psychological impact on the surviving population would be catastrophic. By placing these stability nodes in the heart of the suburbs, the government was ensuring that the sound of order, the hum of the machines, the broadcasting of the numbers, would be the last thing people heard. It was an attempt to maintain the illusion of a functioning state at the street level, even if the cities were gone. But what they found next changed the narrative entirely. In 2002, a group of urban explorers in Pennsylvania managed to enter a derelict windowless house that had been slated for demolition. Inside, they found a room that wasn't filled with computers or radios. It was filled with seismic sensors. These sensors were so sensitive that they could detect the vibrations of a passing car 3 blocks away. Documents recovered from the site, water-damaged and heavily redacted, suggested that the 1,954 project had a secondary, hidden mission. The houses weren't just talking to the military, they were listening to the American people. The project, codenamed Acoustic Horizon, was reportedly designed to monitor for the signature vibrations of a covert subterranean invasion or the movement of heavy machinery. But the sensitivity of the equipment suggested something more intimate. Some researchers have interpreted the data logs as an attempt to record the vibrational heartbeat of the American suburb, monitoring traffic patterns, industrial output, and even the collective movement of crowds during times of civil unrest. What happened next remains unclear, but by the early 1960s, the silent houses began to evolve. As the technology transitioned from bulky vacuum tubes to compact transistors, the massive heat signatures diminished. The houses no longer needed their dead air cooling systems. Many were quietly sold off to private utility companies, while others were converted into actual homes, their windows cut out, their steel doors replaced, their secret histories plastered over with drywall and floral wallpaper. However, a significant number of the original 500 houses were never sold. They remain in the possession of the federal government, often listed on property maps as telecommunications annexes or training facilities. A turning point in the modern re-examination of these structures occurred in 2011 when a digital archive of 1950s aerial photography was released. When the images were analyzed using modern thermal mapping software, it was discovered that 14 of the silent houses are still generating an inexplicable amount of heat. Despite being over 60 years old, and despite the fact that modern server farms are far more efficient than 1,954 hardware, these specific units are running at temperatures that suggest a massive, sustained electrical draw. If the original 1,954 computers have been decommissioned, what is currently operating inside those windowless walls? There is no clear consensus. Some believe the houses have been repurposed as nodes for a modern, high-speed fiber optic network or as secure locations for government metadata storage. Others point to the numbers station phenomenon, which has seen a resurgence in recent years, with localized signals once again being traced back to these mid-century bungalows. One of the most compelling personal stories to emerge from this era is that of Sarah Vance, the daughter of a technician who worked for the project in the late 50s. Sarah recalled that her father would leave for work every morning at 8 a.m. and return at 5 p.m. Yet he never carried a lunchbox, never wore a uniform, and never spoke a word about his office. "I used to ride my bike past the house where he worked," Sarah told an interviewer in 2015. "It was just a plain brick house with no windows, 2 blocks from my school. I used to think it was where the ghosts lived because it never changed. It never got old, and it never got new. My father would walk up to the door, touch a panel, and the house would just swallow him. Sarah's father died in 1982. On his deathbed, he handed her a small, brass key with no markings and a set of coordinates in the Virginia countryside. When Sarah finally visited the location years later, she didn't find a house. She found a ventilation grate in the middle of a field, humming with the same low-frequency vibration she remembered from her childhood. This suggests that the 500 houses were only the surface manifestation of a much larger, much deeper architecture. For every windowless house in a suburban cul-de-sac, there may be a sprawling, multi-level facility buried beneath it, part of a shadow map of America that was drawn in 1954 and never erased. And that's when the evidence layers began to point toward a final, even more unsettling possibility. The final possibility, and perhaps the most unsettling one, emerged not from the study of the houses themselves, but from the study of the people who lived around them. In 2018, a sociological researcher at a university in Maryland began to analyze the health and census records of the specific neighborhoods where the 1,954 houses were located. She found a statistical anomaly that could not be explained by socioeconomic factors or environmental pollution. In the decades following 1,954, the residents living within a 3-block radius of these windowless units reported a significantly higher incidence of auditory sleep disturbances and a peculiar form of localized insomnia. Even more startling was the discovery of frequency attunement, a phenomenon where long-term residents claimed to be able to feel when the weather was about to change or when a large-scale electrical event was occurring, miles away. This has led some historians to interpret the 1,954 project not just as a hardware network, but as a large-scale experiment in human-machine resonance. If the houses were indeed massive antennas, using the very structures of the suburbs as a conductor, the people living inside the real homes were, by default, living inside the circuit. Whether this was an intentional psychological study or an unforeseen side effect of early Cold War technology remains a subject of intense debate. What is clear, however, is that by the mid-1960s, the silent houses began to disappear from the maps, even as they remained on the streets. In a process known as tactical integration, the government began to camouflage the remaining units. Many were fitted with faux windows, panes of black glass that reflected the street but allowed no light to pass through. Others were covered in vinyl siding that mirrored the popular styles of the 1970s and 80s. To the casual passerby, they were just slightly eccentric, poorly maintained homes. But to the specialized technicians who still serviced them under the cover of utility work, they remained nodes. But that wasn't the strangest part. In 2020, a Freedom of Information Act request regarding the decommissioning of the 1,954 project returned a response that was almost entirely blacked out. However, one unredacted sentence at the bottom of the final page caught the attention of researchers. It read, "The architectural integrity of the 500 units must be maintained regardless of active hardware status, as the ground coupling remains sensitive." Ground coupling is a term usually reserved for seismology or high-energy physics. Its use in the context of suburban houses suggests that the structures were never meant to be removed. They were anchors. Today, if you look closely at the older suburbs of Arlington, Virginia, Columbus, Ohio, or the outskirts of Los Angeles, you can still find them. They are the houses that never have a for sale sign. They are the houses where the grass is always mown by a generic landscaping crew that arrives in an unmarked white van. They are the houses that, even in the height of summer, never have a window open to catch the breeze. The mystery of the 500 windowless houses of 1,954 is a testament to a time when the line between civilian life and national defense was not just blurred, it was built into the very bricks of our neighborhoods. It reminds us that the suburbs weren't just a place to raise families. They were a landscape of hidden utility, a grid of silent guardians designed to keep a secret that was too big for a single bunker. As modern re-examination continues, the evidence layers suggest that we are only now beginning to understand the true scope of the 1,954 project. With the advent of smart home technology and the increasing density of our digital signals, some theorists believe the silent houses are being reactivated, serving as localized dark hubs for a new era of data collection. Whether they are relics of a paranoid past or active components of a hidden present, the houses remain. They sit at the end of our streets, blind and deaf to the world around them, yet perhaps more aware of our lives than we are of theirs. In the archives of the National Security Agency, There is reportedly a map known as the 1954 overlay. It is said to show the United States not by its state lines or its cities, but by its vibrational nodes. If you were to look at that map, you would see 500 points of light, forming a shimmering web across the continent. For the people who live next door to these structures, the mystery is not a matter of history. It is a matter of the low hum they hear in their basements on a Tuesday night. It is the heat they feel radiating from a brick wall that has no fireplace. It is the realization that their quiet, suburban life is built around a hollow core. The 500 unmarked houses appeared in 1954, and while the world has changed beyond recognition in the decades since, the houses have not. They remain exactly as they were, windowless, silent, and entirely unexplained. Records suggest that the project was a success. What it succeeded at, however, remains a secret held behind steel doors and brick-painted plates. The silent houses are a reminder that sometimes the greatest mysteries are the ones we walk past every single day, the ones that look exactly like home, but feel like something else entirely. What happened next remains unclear, as the paper trail for the 1954 project officially ends in 1992. But as long as the thermal cameras show those strange, glowing spots in the middle of our neighborhoods, the story is far from over. We are left with the silence of the structures and the memories of people like Sarah Vance, who still has the brass key that fits no known lock. Perhaps the key isn't meant for a door. Perhaps it is a reminder of a time when the government decided that 500 houses didn't need to see the world, because the world was already being watched from within. The sun sets on another suburban evening, the lights go on in the kitchens and the living rooms of America. But at the end of the block, one house remains dark. It has no windows to catch the twilight, and no one is inside to turn on a lamp. Yet, if you listen closely, you can hear the hum, the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of a machine that has been waiting since 1954 for a signal that has yet to arrive. Or perhaps it is a signal that has been broadcasting all along, at a frequency we have simply learned to ignore.